Hi, I'm Lee Carter, and I wanted to record another installment of the Ruth lessons if you've been listening. Um, Today, we're going to talk about chapter 2. So, hopefully, that will be something. This is something that's been encouraging for you. It's been good for me to revisit it again as well. Last time we talked about chapter 1, and at the end of chapter 1, um, we saw that as Naomi and Ruth come into Bethlehem, that Naomi is remembered by the people there. Those who stayed and waited out the famine, the ones who took the punishment that God had manifested onto the nation, they waited out the famine, and they're still there when Naomi returns. She tells them not to call her Naomi, to call her bitter, Mary or Mara, which means bitter. And we see that Naomi really feels punished or ignored by God. She cannot see the blessings in her life for all the tragedies. While Naomi doesn't seem to realize what Ruth's presence is going to mean for her, conditions are, in fact, harsh for them. As widows, Ruth and Naomi would have had no social status at all. They are unprotected by a man, which would have been an intolerable situation in any kind of emergency situation or if there were trouble in the community. However, what we're going to see is through Ruth's industriousness and God's providence that Ruth is going to meet the man who will change things for both of them. At the beginning of chapter 2, we are introduced to a new character in our story. His name is Boaz. His name means swift strength. And we are told several times in this chapter that Boaz is a relative of Elimelech. Now, this is the first suggestion that he could be the solution to their problem. Not only is Boaz a relative, he's a man of great wealth or a man of standing, it says. He has the family connection, which means that if he chooses to do so, he can stand up for the rights of these women. An interesting note, just something I found when I was studying this, is that Boaz is actually listed in the genealogy of David in First Chronicles chapter 2. He's called the son of Salma, who was apparently married to Rahab, the harlot from Jericho. It's actually more likely that he was her grandson, or Salma and Rahab's grandson. If there may be a break in the list, but again, we don't know when in Judges we are, so it's hard to know exactly. But he is descended from Salma and Rahab. It's also an interesting note that Boaz is going to be remembered in other ways as well. When Solomon builds the temple, the left column that supported the portico was called Boaz. The one on the right was called Jachin, which was either after the fourth son of Simeon, or there was another Jachin that was a priest under David. But I find that interesting that we see him recorded in the genealogy and then remembered in such a specific way in the temple. In Deuteronomy 25 and verses 5 through 10, we read that under the old law, when a man died, his relatives had not just first dibs on his things and on his wife even, but they actually had responsibilities towards his wife if she had not had a son. If she has a son, then the responsibility for the mother falls on him. But without a son, the responsibility of the woman falls to her dead husband's brother to take her in and care for her, and if possible, to provide her with a son who would then be given the dead brother's name so that that man's line and name could continue. If a man declined to honor this responsibility, the woman could go to the gate. The gate was where the elders sat, and she could say that her brother-in-law refused to perform his duties. The elders would call the man to them and try to convince him to take her. But if he still refused, then the brother's wife would take the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and say, so it shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. This is all strange to us, but the best I could tell was that really, in other words, he was then in danger of having his name removed from the memory of the community. There must have been a good reason. There needed to be a good reason if the man refused his duty. This was also true of land dealings when a relative died and left land or sold it and wanted to buy it back. If in Leviticus 25:25, there's a verse that says, if one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possessions, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. So if somebody had sold land in order to get money quickly, then his relatives could come and redeem that land later. The idea that's actually stated earlier than Leviticus 25 and Leviticus 25:23 is that all of the land belonged to God anyway. It wasn't really theirs. So ownership was a fluid thing, because the understanding in Israel that they only have it because God gave it to them. They are sojourners in a land that was not their own. And that was an idea that they understood, at least partially. All of these ideas of responsibility and redemption are going to be important in the plot of this story, because Boaz is going to be the hope of Naomi and Ruth. He can save them according to the laws of God, and he is a man who lives in accordance with God's law. Where Elimelech showed weakness in many ways, Boaz is strong. And where Naomi and Ruth are in need, Boaz is able to provide. He is going to be the means by which Ruth and Naomi find food, favor, and eventually they're going to find a home. In accordance with the laws of Deuteronomy 24, Ruth sets out to glean in verse 2 of chapter 2. So let's take a minute here and look at one of the agricultural terms involved in the story. Some of you may already know these parts of the harvest. I didn't, being a city girl. But understanding the process helped me greatly in understanding what's happening. Gleaning is the act of collecting leftover crops from a farmer's field after they have been commercially harvested, or on fields where it's not economically profitable to harvest, or that didn't have much of a crop to begin with. And so it's this idea of coming in and taking what's just been dropped or left by either man or machine. In Deuteronomy 24, in verses 19 through 22, God commands Israel to care for widows and orphans. These verses actually explain the request that Ruth makes in verse 2 of chapter 2. They read, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes in your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterwards. It will be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and therefore I command you to do these things. So these laws actually provided a way for the poor, for the orphans and widows, to provide for themselves without having to ask for charity. They could work for their food. And one thing that becomes increasingly evident about Ruth is that she is not afraid to work. She is going to provide for herself and for Naomi by gleaning. And so Ruth goes and asks permission from Naomi to go glean in the fields, and Naomi tells her to go. It's interesting that Naomi doesn't seem to give Ruth much direction. You know, she doesn't tell her to go glean in the fields of their kinsmen. And why she doesn't warn Ruth about the dangers that she might face as a lone, vulnerable foreign woman working among strange men. It's all very curious to me. Perhaps Naomi is disappointed that her kinsmen have not reached out to her, that she just doesn't expect that they're going to take any consideration for her at all. Maybe she's too proud to approach a kinsman and ask him to protect her daughter-in-law who intends to clean in the fields. Maybe she's so focused still on herself and her own suffering, that when as she was when she told the women of Bethlehem that she had left full and came back empty, that she is forgetting to be grateful for Ruth and just tells her to go on and go. We can tell that Ruth is anxious, actually, about gleaning in the fields of Bethlehem. She expresses the hope that she'll find someone with a kind heart to allow her to glean near him and who will offer her his protection. It was dangerous, actually, for a poor single woman who did not have the protection of a man to be gleaning in a field full of strange men, which is really where Ruth finds herself. This is the first time that we see that Naomi calls Ruth daughter, suggesting that Ruth's love and devotion and sense of responsibility for the welfare of her mother-in-law is reciprocated by Naomi and appreciated. When Ruth finds herself in Boaz's field, she doesn't seem to know whose field she's in, which would make sense. She's not from Bethlehem. She doesn't know whose land is whose. But the wording actually almost seems to indicate that she begins gleaning in another field and just kind of works her way over to Boaz's field. And of course, we can see God directing her steps. She's looking for a field of one with whom she might find favor, and providentially happens to come to Boaz's field. The one who Naomi and Ruth are going to put all of their hope in has also come to the field that day. And again, we are reminded that he is related to Elimelech. The first thing that Boaz says in the story is a blessing to his reapers. The Lord be with you. His workers were probably not slaves or servants, but most likely they were townspeople who he employed to bring in the harvest. They could have been people who, like migrant workers who come from other places, but Boaz would have known or trusted his head reaper to know them. And this person answers him in kind, the Lord bless you. His greeting may have been accompanied by a gesture. There was quite a lot in the commentaries about the way these workers may have greeted Boaz, maybe a kiss on the cheek or hand if a person was a close friend, or maybe a bow and a handshake, something like we would do today. But his greeting of his workers actually tells us quite a lot about him. His workers, first of all, don't seem to cower under his glare. He's friendly and open in his greeting, which actually he doesn't have any social obligation to even offer. And he's the owner of the field. Greeting the reapers is not something he has to do. He greets them because that's who he is. And I know this is a little phrase, but words matter. The way we speak to people and the way we greet people, the things we talk about, our words matter. Even just this initial blessing speaks volumes about who Boaz is. Our words tell others who we are too. How do we talk? What do we talk about? When I was immature and young, I actually said some terrible things. I was the kind of person who would say things just to watch people's faces, see what they had to do with that. And I wish I could take things back. When I took my son to Florida College, my sister Elizabeth went with me, and I told her, I said, the thing I'm dreading the most is seeing people who knew me then. It's embarrassing. Now, of course, I am grateful, so grateful for the fact that I did not have social media, at least then, because of course now our words are often broadcast to thousands of our nearest and dearest, many of whom we don't even know. We don't know who they are. And by the way, those words never go away. And we have to think about, what is it that we're putting out there? What is it that we like or share? Because those become our words too. And our words indicate the content of our hearts. I really try hard not to get sucked into conversations that are unproductive or negative. That doesn't mean that I can't sit and chat. I can. It's not really my strong suit, to be fair, but I I have to constantly make a conscious effort to watch my words. And sometimes I do better than others. But that is something that I certainly have to concentrate on, and I am guessing I'm not the only one. Hopefully, most of the time, if we're going to talk about other people, it's for some good reason. Maybe there are things that we need to know about each other. I certainly would like to be aware of any hardship or need of assistance that I can help with. Or it's nice for me to know ahead of time before talking to someone about topics that are tender and sensitive for them, so that I don't inadvertently hurt them or embarrass them or stick my foot in my mouth somehow. I'm not talking about that kind of conversation. When we enter into the territory of idle talk, or we just take pleasure in sharing bad news about somebody, private details, or we are speculating about someone, then those conversations are not productive. And we need to end them or stop them or remove ourselves from them. Because really, that's just meanness. And even if that's not the way we intend it, it's what it is. And we need to get ourselves out of those situations. Um, I also have to watch that I don't talk too much about my child. Those of us who are mothers, we need to be careful about going on and on about our children, because in reality, that's just another way of talking about us. And we have to be conscious of that. That may be tougher for some of us than just talking about ourselves personally. I have a tendency to talk more about John. Just as Boaz's words tell us about him, our words tell others about us as well. It's something to think about. After Boaz greets his reapers, he sees Ruth and he asks who she is. Whose young woman is this? He notices Ruth. We aren't told why he notices her. Maybe she's alone. Maybe he already knows everyone else. Maybe she's beautiful. We're not told. Maybe he realizes she's not his employee. She's just a stranger in the field. We have no idea. He notices her because that's what God would have him to do. Ruth has been brought from Moab for this moment. And the head reaper identifies her. He identifies Ruth as the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi. Certainly the story would have been circulated. There doesn't seem to be a need to fill in the details for Boaz. He knows who she is. The worker further explains that Ruth had asked if she could glean in the field. She actually is entitled to glean in the field, but she asked anyway. Not only is she a widow, which entitles her by the law, but she's also a stranger. So she fits into the groups that would be provided for under the law. However, the permission to glean in the fields was not always guaranteed, and so Ruth had asked. The worker also tells Boaz that she's been there since morning, continuously working with the exception of a short break in the house. The time of year for the barley harvest would have been early spring, and it would have likely been an activity in which the whole town would have been involved, especially if you think about this is after a famine. So this would have been especially exciting, we would think, right? That now there are crops that are being produced. The harvest would have taken place after or as the men were returning from the Passover observations. And so Ruth, in an effort not to take advantage of the kindness of the head reaper, she limits her request with what she's allowed to take. She doesn't ask to take all of what she would have been entitled to. She asks to take the stalks that fall from the sheaves. So she does limit her request, and she is humble. She's not asking for all of the ones that are left, but only the ones that have fallen. She's practical and humble in her request to this head reaper, and he indicates that she's been working diligently from morning until now. And now that he knows who she is, Boaz reaches out and reveals the strength of his character with his interaction with Ruth. We're going to read part of the exchange from verses 8 through 16. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along with after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, you go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I've been told about all what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders out to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." Now, there are several interesting points about what Boaz offers to Ruth, both directly and then indirectly when she can't hear him. He goes beyond the letter of the law, the requirement to leave food for the poor. He provides for her need for water. He tells her, "Go get water out of the urns that the men have filled." His care is so great for her that he even thinks about water, that she's going to be thirsty. He tells her to stay in his fields near his women where it's going to be safer. He offers her protection. He tells his young men to stay away from her and not to reproach her, not only not to touch her, but not to talk to her in any kind of derogatory or ugly or harsh way. He asks her to eat with him. He gives her a place at the table with his workers, and it's a meal that doesn't come out of what she's gleaned. And then he tells the workers privately to drop extra grain for her to have. His generosity goes well beyond expectation. Boaz is not a man who is simply ticking a box. This isn't just about keeping the law. He goes far beyond what he's been commanded to provide. Remember when Jesus tells the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23 that they count out seeds for tithe, but they show no mercy? "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Those you ought to have done without the others undone." Blind guides, you strain a gnat and swallow a camel. Boaz shows the strength of his character by not only providing what he should for Ruth, but by surpassing that and providing what he can, what he has the ability and the resources and the authority to provide. Boaz is a model of how the law was always intended to function in the lives of godly people. It was a guide, a tutor to righteous living. And Jesus points out to the Pharisees, you missed the point. Boaz did not. He doesn't do it for recognition. In fact, I think he doesn't want Ruth to hear him tell the workers to drop extra because he doesn't want to embarrass or shame her in any way. He doesn't expect or want to be thanked. It should cause us to think about our service. Are we simply ticking boxes? Showed up for services, check. Put money in the collection plate, check. Said a prayer, check. Called a sick person, check. What we do is important, but why we do it is everything. We can't do some things and leave others undone. We talked in the last lesson about wearing ourselves out. Are you worn out? Are you worn out? Am I worn out? I think about the old song, there's much to do, there's work on every hand. Hark the cry for help goes ringing through the land. I don't know if you remember that one. Here am I, send me. Ready at thy bidding, Lord, send me, is in the chorus. I think about that. Are we ready? Am I ready at his bidding? Sometimes it's hard to figure out how to serve. I think especially for young people, we've talked about that before. But we just have to pay attention and look around. In verse 10, Ruth falls on her face. Why? I'm a foreigner. Where has this favor come from? It is incomprehensible to her that Boaz would offer this. Boaz tells her part of it is that he's honoring her conduct and her reputation. It has been fully reported to me all that you've done for your mother-in-law. He knows of her loyalty to Naomi. He acknowledges that these loyalties have come at a personal cost for Ruth. That you left your homeland and your family and came with her. He appreciates her denial and her sacrifice, her self-denial and her self-sacrifice. Reputation matters. Ruth's actions and loyalties have been discussed in Bethlehem. The head reaper knows who she is. Doubtless, he knows the whole story. Boaz seems to have heard the story. And that's not likely unless it's widely reported. He certainly doesn't seem to be the type who's gossipy based on his character. Reputation is everything. You know, maybe you have a reputation to overcome. I certainly have felt like that in my life. Maybe you've said or done things that you're ashamed of as well. The reality is that if we're transformed by the laws of God, the love of God, the acceptance of the mercy of God, then in many ways that old person ceases to exist. I learned a long time ago that I just apologize and move forward. It takes time to prove that there has actually been a transformation. And I can't live in the past. We have to put the past behind us, our successes and our failures, and move forward in our spiritual lives. I have to get busy and show people with my actions that I am changed. I was in Jacksonville one summer when Don Bunting was there, and he had a sermon on Philippians, and he talked about creating a habit of service. And if we don't feel like it and we do it anyway, his point is that it becomes a habit, and our habits become who we are. I can make myself develop characteristics that I don't have by nature. In fact, I have to make myself develop characteristics that I don't have by nature. And in the beginning, that may be a conscious effort. But eventually, it becomes part of who we are. You know, you think about Saul when he becomes Paul. He's known by his reputation. People are scared of him. They don't want anything to do with him. He worked for years to change what people thought of him. And sometimes we do too. It's also worth noting that we have to allow people the opportunity to change, because it is certainly something that we all need. We need to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We want the opportunity to become something new, but we often don't extend the same opportunity to others. And everyone deserves the chance. My reputation really should be what Ruth's is. When Boaz hears who is in his field, he goes to her and shows her through his own kindness and mercy that he appreciates her loyalty and kindness to Naomi. Finally, Boaz pronounces a blessing on Ruth. He asks that she will be rewarded by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Remember that phrase, because we're going to get to that, back to that in chapter 3. He recognizes not only her need for protection, but he also recognizes that she has made a conscious decision to come to Jehovah for refuge. That's what has won her esteem in his eye. Her reputation has preceded her. He's heard the whole story, and he seems to understand that Ruth's change of ethnic and national identity is, at least to some extent, also spiritual in nature. She said, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. It was an oath that Ruth took. She knew it when she said it, and Boaz knows it too. Ruth's trust, whatever it may have been when she came, is not placed in the Moabite gods. Those were gods that she abandoned when she left Moab and made the oath to Naomi. Ruth's trust must now be in Yahweh, the mighty God of Israel. The word refuge is mainly used in the Psalms, and it indicates a personal association with God. It's not a national or a territorial association. And so Boaz says that it's the God of Israel in whom Ruth takes refuge. He accepts her as a follower of Jehovah. He knows what that has cost her, and it does cost something. It always does. Jesus says there's no king that goes into battle without doing the math, and no man who builds a tower in a field without plans to finish it. It costs something. It has cost Ruth something. It cost us something. What does it cost to follow Christ? Maybe friends, maybe family, a job, a boy, Sunday mornings, maybe all of the above. What it really costs us is ourselves. You lose yourself and you find yourself all at the same time. Boaz affirms that her abandonment, her willingness to uproot herself geographically, no matter how difficult, has brought her under the wing of God. Make no mistake, Ruth has not combined the belief of Moab and the belief of Israel. She hasn't merged these religions, these deities in her head. She has come to Jehovah. And Boaz recognizes that. It also tells us that Ruth has kept her promise. It's important that the words come from his mouth because he needs to see her as a woman of Israel in order to see her as a potential wife and one who needs his protection. And so in these 3 ways, offering food and protection and favor, honoring her reputation, and pronouncing a blessing, Boaz again reveals who he is to us. He, through his own kindness, is actually going to become the answer to his own blessing, to this request. He prays that she will be blessed, and she's going to be through him. The Lord does bless Ruth with Boaz. Ruth must have been humbled by this. She responds formally and with gratitude by falling on her face. She's hardworking. We know that. She's humble and submissive. She says she doesn't have even the standing of one of his servants. She still feels unworthy, a foreigner, she says, with no standing. And although after Boaz pronounces the blessing on her, Ruth calls herself his maidservant. She no longer calls herself a foreigner, as she called herself in verse 10. She does seem to offer his, she does seem to accept, rather, his offer of protection, even though she is astounded, must be astounded by the generosity of this man. Remember, at the beginning, all she wanted was somebody to be kind to her, just somebody to be kind, and how he has surpassed even the wildest dreams that she might have had of kindness. She and Boaz both have such noble hearts and characters that they are on full display to everyone around them. And we are able to see God's providence as a worthy woman meets a worthy man. Finally, at the end of the chapter, Ruth returns to the fields after her conversation with Boaz and gleans until evening. And when she returns home to Naomi, She comes in with an abundance of food. She's been on the job one day, and she has enough food for about 5 days. An ephah of barley is roughly 6 US gallons of grain, or 22, almost 23 liters. So just to give us an idea, 5 gallons of grain would weigh about 30 pounds or 13.6 kilos. So Ruth is carrying roughly anywhere between 36 pounds or around 36 pounds or about 16 kilos of grain home to Naomi. So she's got quite a load. Can you imagine what Naomi must have thought when Ruth comes through the door with all that load, probably on her head and on her back? Through the generosity of Boaz, by the way, Ruth isn't even aware of the full extent of his generosity because she doesn't know that they are dropping additional stalks of grain. But through his generosity and her industriousness, Ruth and Naomi now have food almost enough for a week. After just one day of gleaning, not even harvesting. She's just picking up the leftovers in the field. She's not part of the harvest at all. And Ruth also, remember, had some of her lunch tucked away. So she, it says in verse 18, she brought it out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. So Ruth's selfless care of Naomi is inspiring. Practically speaking, Boaz has met the immediate needs of the women. They are no longer desperate. Naomi blesses Boaz before she ever knows whose field Ruth has been in. Blessed be the one who took notice of you. And when Ruth does tell Naomi that it was Boaz with whom she found favor, another blessing follows. In verse 20, Naomi praises God for his kindness to the living and to the dead. Her utter despair is replaced by hope in God. Ruth renews her faith. Sometimes we just need a reminder that God is constantly blessing us. God didn't just start blessing Naomi. He's been blessing her all along. And now Naomi sees it as well. Also in verse 20, Naomi tells Ruth that Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. In some versions, kinsman redeemer, and in other versions, it's the guardian redeemer. Mosaic law is very specific about who can redeem. It's a male relative, a near blood relative, and they are responsible for rescuing, protecting, and helping weaker relatives. And so all of this is going to set the stage for this marriage narrative. Boaz meets the bill, and Ruth is now recognized as a Hebrew and a member of his house by being Naomi's daughter. Naomi realizes that God has remembered her, and his loyal love has not abandoned her. Instead, he has provided for her needs, both present and potentially in the future. Her faith through Ruth has been restored. Ruth tells Naomi what Boaz said to her, and Naomi says, "That's a great plan. You do exactly what he said." And it is unlikely that Naomi has not at least entertained the idea that Boaz could be a long-term redeemer. As some of you younger women know, sometimes older women stick their noses in, for lack of a better phrase. They don't mind their own business, and they give dating and marriage advice and assistance sometime when none has been requested, perhaps. But it's likely that it has occurred to Naomi that Boaz may be the answer to a much longer term solution, and that he might be a good husband for her daughter, Ruth. All right. We'll start chapter 3 in the next lesson. I hope this is a good review. I know it's not a new book, but I like thinking about it. It's been good for me, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thanks.